ice cream consumption reduces the rate of cardiovascular disease 900% more than the consumption of yogurt. Hi, everyone. Today we're going to be responding to a video. It's actually a much longer video, but this is just a short 15-minute clip of it. An interview between the Proof, so that's Simon Hill. I think he's an Australian, not 100% sure. And he's talking with Walter Willett. Now, Walter Willett is he's really the biggest name in epidemiology, and he's at the T. Chan School of Public Health, I think is the name of it, in Harvard. And this is about dairy. So last week we did dairy. I thought we'll do dairy again. Let's see what they have to say.
You published a paper in 2016 with Chen Mu. Mm-hmm. Hopefully I pronounced that right. And it was on dairy fats.
Right.
And I found that paper to be particularly interesting. I'm interested in what were the major takeaways of that research and how your views have specifically maybe evolved when it comes to this food group, dairy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, dairy's, I think, the most interesting food group because it's very complicated, and it's not like sugar-sweetened beverages where just everything is bad, no good. But dairy clearly.
So it's interesting when asked to pick when he sort of comes up with an example of the worst-case food. I think 10 years ago, this guy would have picked meat. He would have said a steak or something. Now he's saying sugar-sweetened beverages, right? So for him, steaks are still unhealthy, but it's interesting how the discourse has changed. I think it shows maybe our educational efforts are paying off. I don't know.
It really has a lot of positive benefits, a lot of beneficial, essential nutrients in it, but also some potential harmful effects as well, consumed in high amounts, especially all through life. So, and dairy.
So if that were true, right? If that were true, then we would look at societies that take a lot of dairy. So again, the Maasai come to mind. The Mongolians also come to mind. Traditional Mongolian diets, very, very high in dairy. Even, let's say, traditional dairy-based Indian diets, which have a lot of ghee, especially in North India. There's a study, which maybe I'll put on the screen now. I don't have it to hand, so I'm not going to share a screen, but I'll put it in post. Basically showing that actually Indians who ate ghee, this is now 50 years ago, so seed oils weren't really a huge thing. In North India at the time, you couldn't get, people were using ghee, so that's dairy fat. And they did much better than South Indians, even though they were eating more carbohydrates and more calories. So that's an interesting study to look at. Indian Railways, 1966, I want to say. I'll try and put it on the screen.
Actually, our family has been a dairy family for generations, and I grew up in a dairy research farm when I was young. So it's always been of interest. And basically dairy looks like it's sort of in the middle of the spectrum between healthful food and unhealthy food. So if we look at total mortality, we see that, of course, the worst is processed red meat then.
I don't think that's true, right? So depends what we mean, but processed red meat is a term that can include anything from like Spam to like biltong, right? So I just don't think that the data bears that out. The worst is going to be sugar again. So even though I don't know what he means by processed red meat, does he mean like home hanged biltong, like dried meat, or does he mean again Spam and highly processed things with lots of seed oils and so on?
Eggs and unprocessed red meat, dairy is sort of in the middle.
Eggs, again, like what are you talking about? We have studies showing that people who consume a lot of eggs, they tend to do better in poor income countries, especially giving children an additional egg per day. This is a study done in Kenya a few years ago. Giving the same child in the same household, giving one child an extra egg per day resulted in better growth, better IQ, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then we have case studies. Okay, so it's not an RCT, but he's not talking about RCTs either, where we have people who were consuming 20 eggs a day for a long period of time seem to be doing just fine.
But if you really want to go to low risk, then healthy plant foods would be are associated with the lowest.
So I just want to point out how counterintuitive this is, right? What does healthy plant foods mean? Because all plant foods have anti-nutrients. By definition, plants need to have poisons in them in order to survive, right? So yes, humans have learned to detoxify, to prevent, and so on, and to minimize the poisons in those things for us. but we don't have the digestive capability to do that inside our body. We have to do it outside of our body, right? So what does that tell us? Like, how can there be such a thing as healthy plant foods? Or maybe there could be, but it would have to be conditioned, right? Healthy for some people at some periods of time, right?
Mortality. So whether you say dairy is good or bad, again, it's the substitution that's so critical. If you're having some dairy foods replacing red meat, or I sort of use the example, buying a sandwich, do you want bologna or cheese or peanut butter? And the best would be peanut butter.
That is demonstrably untrue for a large percentage of people who have peanut allergies, et cetera, et cetera. Not even peanut allergies. Peanuts have lectins in them. They will, anti-nutrients, it's really important to understand this. Anti-nutrients will reduce the absorption of proper nutrients, right? So if you have, say, bread, which has anti-nutrients in it, with meat, I've come to think of it as like it's kind of a trade-off. You're not really making any progress forward if you're having the bread, the anti-nutrients with the nutrients that are in meat. But if you have the bread with peanut butter, these are only anti-nutrients. And eventually, and this happened to all of my vegan friends, including myself, eventually you reach the stage where you're actually depleting your body of serious nutrition that it needs to survive. And you want to see that in a year or two, especially if you start a vegan diet at a young age. It will take a long time to begin to see that, but you will eventually see that. At least that's what we've seen in 100% of my friends who went vegan in the 90s, right?
And all of them on whole grain, of course. But for diabetes, it looks dairy is pretty neutral. For weight gain, there's some suggestion in some studies that there might be a little bit less weight gain, but when we looked at it in detail, it looked like most of that the benefit was coming from yogurt, and we adjusted for yogurt. We didn't see benefit.
So these guys love yogurt. They're really obsessed with this idea that yogurt is a health food. And when you look at the data, we'll get to the data in a bit. I want to see what else he has to say. But when we looked at the data, I just don't see the effect size of yogurt being anything to write home about.
For weight gain or type 2 diabetes.
What about the fat content? If someone's trying to navigate this, so within the yogurt section of the grocery store or even milk, there's high fat versions and low fat versions. I think this is a really interesting thing to explore. There's a lot of research on what are the types of saturated fats that are in dairy. Are they behaving differently to saturated fats, say, in meat? What would be important for people to understand here?
Yeah. So it's important to understand dairy is the only food that's commonly consumed that is where the fat is majority saturated. If you have something like beef, I think it's about 48, 49% saturated, but still majority MUFA and PUFA, monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats, right? So if you want to prove that saturated fat is unhealthy, dairy is the place you want to be looking. You want to see a big effect size, and you want to look at populations like the Maasai, like the Mongolians, et cetera, who eat a lot of dairy, a dairy-based diet, or the Northern Indians, 50 or 60 years ago, or longer, 70 or 80 years ago, and look, where they're getting lots of heart attacks and so on. And the answer is they weren't, right? Dairy was protective in some of the populations that I'm talking about. In some of especially in that Indian Railway study, where the North Indians were eating ghee, the South Indians were eating peanut oil, from what I can figure out. It doesn't really say; it just says seed oil. But I think it must have been peanut oil, from what I can gather. And they had much higher rates of disease.
For yogurt, it looks like that, and other dairy foods, it looks like it doesn't make a great deal of difference whether it's high fat or low fat for most of the outcomes we've looked at. But the worst, of course, is
so like looking at this is a lot. This whole 15 minutes of this video is going to be a lesson on how epidemiology can't really tell you anything. Like, you can't learn anything of meaning, because when you look at the level of actually what these things are composed of, if you take away the fat, by definition, you're putting in more of the other things, because it's going to be more quantity, right? You take that out, but you keep the volume the same. So the person will eat less fat, and they will eat more sugars. They will eat more lactose, which is the sugar in dairy. They might eat a bit more protein too, although I suspect it'll be a 1-for-1 trade, fat to sugar. So you're trying to tell me that replacing fat with carbohydrate doesn't have a negative effect? Maybe for some people at some time, but on the whole, I would say for the whole population, especially for a metabolically unhealthy population, you do not want to be replacing fat with sugars. That's a really bad idea, right? And we can see that in the lab. We can see that when we do experiments on sugar in blood vessels, right? And we don't need epidemiology to advance that hypothesis.
If it's low fat and then you put back a lot of sugar in its place, that's not going to be the healthiest choice. And
okay, so I think he just mentioned exactly what I was talking about. When you remove the fats, you are, just by definition, you're increasing the percentage of carbohydrate in that dairy product. So there's no such thing as low-fat cream, for example. Cream has to be, or low-fat ghee. There's no such thing. Ghee is only butter fat. That's all it can be.
Look at the grocery store shelves. A lot of these low-fat dairy products are very high in added sugar. But if we look just at dairy fat itself, it's definitely not an optimal fat. And I know there's been ideas that it's got some medium chain.
C15 pops up a lot.
That comes up. It turns out that
C15, the data on C15 is interesting. I'm not sure I'm particularly persuaded one way or the other. Again, from his point of view as an epidemiologist, it certainly doesn't seem to be unhealthy, right? Because you have populations, including populations that he loves to cite, the blue zone populations in Italy, Sardinia, I think, and Greece, definitely, that have a lot of dairy and specifically cheese, and the cheese is particularly high because it's goat's milk and sheep's milk. It's particularly high in this pentadecanoic acid. I might have that somewhat wrong, but that's C15 dairy, right? So, I mean, from my point of view, that's completely meaningless because who cares, right? It doesn't seem to be relevant, and that population doesn't seem to be relevant either. But if you take what he's saying, if you take his basis that you can learn a lot from epidemiology, then certainly we can't say that dairy is unhealthy. We can say that there are populations that consume a lot of dairy fat more than average, and especially a lot of C15 dairy fat, and they seem to be healthier or as healthy as other populations and live as long and have as healthy lifespans, right?
That's very non-specific. It's not specific to dairy.
Doesn't your body make that as well?
Your body can make a little bit, but it can also come from beef as well, and it can come from metabolized from other forms.
This is interesting. So when I did my research, let's do a little googling. Let's do a little googling. Yeah. So I don't really want to trust the AI. Let's take a look at this. Okay. Butter, milk, cream, fatty fish, and brown algae. I'm not so sure about the brown algae. Mullet, catfish, cod. Interesting. But notice that the three highest sources are dairy. Now let's ask a slightly different question. Does beef, because he mentioned beef, contain C15 fatty acid? Yeah, it seems like it might be contained in some. Okay, fatty acid profile of beef, C15. Let's see what it says. Yeah, it's a fairly small. Yeah, it doesn't seem to be that significant. Let's leave it at that for now.
Other fatty acids as well. So unfortunately, it's not a very good indicator.
I think I read one study where vegans had the highest C15 levels.
Really, I hadn't seen that.
Super interesting.
That sounds like nonsense to me. But whatever. If he can, does he cite the study behind this in this? So if you're going to cite a study, it would be nice to put a link or at least a screen capture or something so we know what we're looking at. But I don't believe it. Vegans with the highest level of C15. I say this as someone who I have tested fatty acid profiles of some of my clients, not all of my clients. And the ones with vegetarian, the vegetarian ones tend to have very, very suboptimal, not even vegan, because by the time they come to me, they're not vegan, right? So I'm talking about people who have been eating dairy, who have been eating eggs and so on, but they haven't been eating meat, and their fatty acid profiles are not very close to optimal, right? Way too much PUFA, way too much linoleic acid, et cetera, right? So those are the omega-6s, and not much in the way of these other things, C15 and so on. So maybe I would really be surprised if that were the case.
Yeah, you can get it from non-dairy, definitely from non-dairy sources. But we did a paper specifically looking at dairy fat compared to other types of fat. And clearly for total cardiovascular disease, total mortality, the plant oils were better than dairy fat. Fat from red meat looked a little worse than dairy fat, but that may be still other things in red meat that are contributing to that. And there was one important study that
it would be nice if he referenced which study it is, but knowing that it's Willett, I mean, I think we can just say that this is epidemiological nonsense with very low hazard ratios, as we've discussed in other videos.
And by colleagues at Laval University in Canada, actually funded by the dairy industry.
Laval, yeah, vive le Québec.
To look at the question of was dairy fat from milk not, or said the other way around, is dairy fat and cheese better than dairy fat from milk? And there's been a lot of talk about that over the years. And they did a really well-designed study. As it turned out,
So in my understanding, it's not so much about dairy fat in cheese, it's about fermenting the proteins, right? So because this is why I have some clients who can tolerate cheese, but they can't really tolerate milk, because for some cheeses, especially aged cheeses, that aging process involves some level of fermentation, and it denatures the protein, especially the casein protein, which is thought to be what's problematic. This is the whole discussion around A1 and A2 dairy, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think it's the fatty acids that would be the difference. And again, because he's talking about epidemiology, it's at such a level where you can't distinguish between changes in fatty acid profiles and changes in the protein between those two sources, milk and cheese or whatever it is.
there was a slightly less adverse effect on LDL cholesterol from dairy fat and cheese than from milk.
So once we start talking about LDL cholesterol, again, we're talking about surrogate markers. We're not talking about actual plaquing. If you want to do a study linking dairy with heart disease, you have to do imaging. You have to understand either the calcium scores or the coronary CT angiogram or something like that, the neck, the carotid artery neck intima thickness score. You need something like that. LDL is a useless marker. The more and there's a video that we're going to drop maybe tomorrow or else maybe next week with Dave Feldman, where we go into the counterexample that we have populations with extremely high LDLs and no heart disease, no plaquing, no increased plaquing over time.
To their credit, they also had two other arms to the study. One was a high mono plant oil, and the other was a high polyunsaturated plant oil. And both of those had dramatically lower LDL cholesterol.
So why would that be the case? So there are things in plant oils which lower cholesterol. That is very much understood. But there's no known mechanism whereby the things in animal foods raise cholesterol, right? Which leads me to I wouldn't call it a conclusion, I would call it a working hypothesis that when you are not taking any plant oils, when you are not taking those phytosterols which lower cholesterol, your body is actually able to make the right level of LDL for your body. And whatever it is on a no plant oil diet is actually the right amount. And when you add plant oils, you're messing up with your body's systems. That is my working hypothesis. Like any good scientist, I'm willing to see that disproven, but that's the working hypothesis, and all the data seems to be lining up in that direction.
Compared to either form of dairy fat. And that's really exactly
compared to what?
Yeah, compared to what? Yes.
Right. So if you're swapping out red meat for dairy, if that kind of made sense in a dietary swap, then that could be an improvement.
Slight
improvement, but then going from dairy to some sort of plant fat would be an improvement again.
Right, yeah. Or if you're thinking of these just as added fats.
So whenever they're saying improvement, just keep in mind, they're talking about LDL, which is a marker that we don't care about, right? We care about actual heart disease, right? So yeah, they're talking about improvement in a surrogate marker, which is not meaningful.
Also very important, because we do add quite a bit, maybe about 20% of our calories are added fats. That cheese, that butter is not going to be healthy compared to.
So yeah, Dr. Willett, I don't think he's a medical doctor. I could be incorrect. He's an epidemiologist. He's a PhD in epidemiology. He's kind of like one of those people who sort of defined the field for the past 30, 40 years. So in some ways, he's one of the people to blame for whatever the state of nutrition scientist is right now, or nutrition science is right now, or he's someone to give credit to if you like the state of nutrition science, okay? So when he's giving advice, when he's talking about what's good and what's bad, just keep that in mind, okay?
Plant oils like olive oil or canola oil or soybean oil.
Butter tends to have
So canola and soybean, like these tend to be highly refined, highly processed seed oils that are already oxidized before you ingest them. So there's never going to be a case where ingesting oxidized seed oils is a good thing. Never, right?
A worse effect on LDL, right, compared to cheese. My understanding was that was because of how refined it is, that milk fat globule gets broken down. Is that why it would have a more delta?
So again, what he's talking is complete nonsense. There's no known mechanism whereby any animal food raises LDL. There are known mechanisms whereby plant foods lower LDL. And by the way, if you want to look that up, consider that coconut oil, which is much higher in saturated fat than dairy. It's very close to like pure saturated fat. I want to say 90%. That in some studies actually maintains or even lowers LDL. So it's not the saturated fat which is doing that, right?
There is a fake.
I'm not really sure there is, but I think those are small differences. And of course, it's hard to compare those directly because cheese has the protein, and that's going to other components. And just the amount, if you're using it on a total gram basis, you get more saturated fat from butter than you would from cheese.
So I think all of that makes sense from a substitution point of view. Question that.
So, I mean, listen, for many problems, including the gut health problems that I'm focused on at the moment, taking butter tends to help, like in very short matter, in a very short measure. Increasing butter consumption tends to associate, again, I can't claim causation either, but we give it to our clients, we give it to our patients, and we see that their guts heal very, very quickly. So when people are telling you it's not healthy and based on LDL, like how? Tell me how butter raises LDL, first of all.
I think that naturally leads to is, of course, if we look at all foods and you kind of think, okay, if you replace that for that, it's healthier. You could end up just keep doing that and you're left with one food. So we have to have a dietary pattern.
Right.
So how does someone who is including dairy in their diet today think about its inclusion? So if we come back to dietary pattern, from a dose point of view, I think you did mention this at the beginning, but I think it's worth sort of underlining again. What would the recommendation be there?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to look at this through several lenses. First of all, the direct effect on an individual, then the whole dietary food system, and then diet, then sustainability as well. Because if we don't get climate change right, we don't get anything right either. And for an individual,
Yeah, I don't really. I mean, I have thoughts and I've written extensively about climate change. I don't really want to get into that here. Let's see what he says. Like, if we're answering a very specific question with these kind of videos, we're supposed to be answering a very specific question, which is dairy healthy or not? Like it says in the title, is dairy good or bad for you? That's the question that we're supposed to be addressing.
It's I think given all the pluses and minuses of dairy, a range of 0 to 2 servings of dairy could be healthy, but I think one serving a day is a pretty reasonable number to aim for. That's what I do, and probably mostly in the form of yogurt, which does look like it may be a little bit better than other forms of dairy food.
I want to look at. Let me look at this. So there is a study where, which I'm going to show right now, where. So this is actually done in Dr. Willett's. I won't call it his lab, but in his department, and he is one of the people who I think he graded this PhD dissertation. So I'll show the cover page in just a second, but right now let's look at this. Right, so this table 2.4, the hazard ratios of cardiovascular disease according to intakes of various dairy foods in participants from both the NHS and the health professionals. So this is the so-called nurses' health study and the follow-up and so on. And if you look at yogurt, right, slightly unhealthy in some of the models. And slightly healthy a little bit here. So these are very, very, very tiny. Like this is just noise. There's nothing. 1.03. So if it's above 1, if it's 1, it's neutral, right? If it's above 1, it's slightly unhealthy, and if it's below 1, it's slightly healthy. So I don't think so, man. I don't think that that there's much to see here, right? But they're really, really, really keen. Even this 0.95. So remember, just to review what we've done in previous videos. If there's a hazard ratio of less than 2.0 on the plus side, so it means it's doubling the risk or more, or less than, let's say, 0.75 or greater than 0.75 on the reward side. So in other words, it's reducing by 75% the signal that we see in the epidemiological data. It's not a cause. It's these are still correlations. Only when you see that kind of number can we begin to posit that something may be causal here, right? So none of this is reaching anywhere near there. And I think if we look through more figures, high fat dairy, low fat dairy, dairy without yogurt, dairy with yogurt. So these are very, very tiny. These are substitutions, very, very tiny changes, and really nothing to see here. 0.98, 0.99. This is really, really, really small. I don't think it could get much smaller. These associations. So when he's saying yogurt is healthy, and the thing is, what I want to point out is either this is selective memory or he's lying, because he graded this dissertation and it's based on all the data sets that he likes. He's the guy one of the people who marked this dissertation and gave it a pass, right? Oh, sorry. Let me just share give credit to the author here. Let's just go right to the top. This is by Andres Victor Ardison Korat. And I found out about this through this paper in The Atlantic. we'll get into this in a little bit because I think he might. Let's see if he mentions ice cream or not. I brought this up in the hope that he might, but let's see what he says.
It's possibly because of the microbiome effects.
Do you choose a full fat dairy?
Yeah, really. So again, his own data, and I know this because it's not just those data sets. It's not just this PhD dissertation. It's a lot of data sets basically show no effect for yogurt. I mean, they've tried to prove it again and again and again and again, and there's no effect. But he's still saying it as if it's fact.
Without added sugar, or do you go for a low fat without added sugar?
Yeah. Well, I think an important point is if you're just having one serving a day, it doesn't matter very much whether it's low fat or full fat. If you're having 3 servings a day, then you definitely don't want that much dairy fat in your diet. But
so there's no basis for concluding that. And there are cultures that consume 3 servings or more of dairy fat per day and do fine.
If I step back, none of that fat gets thrown away or burned. It's too valuable. So once that cow is milked, somebody's eating that fat, dairy fat, and often it's the same person having it as cream or ice cream or something else. So there's no public health benefit of dairy fat. The only benefit is to the dairy industry because they get a double profit with low.
There's no public health benefit to dairy fat. I certainly in the context in which I have worked, so in sub-Saharan Africa, in India, and so on, that's just simply untrue. There's a public health benefit to food. Dairy fat is food. We're dealing with starving populations. Dairy fat is important, and it's also like it's. I hesitate to use the word calorie because that's not the right way to think about it, but it is a dense food, right? You can have just a little bit of dairy and you can go for a long period of time, or a little bit of ghee or butter or whatever it is. It will keep you going for a long time. And if you've had the honor of going mountain climbing in Nepal, which I haven't really done, but I've been in Nepal and I've talked with Sherpas and so on, the butterfat and is a big, and yak fat and so on, yak cheese. This is a big way in which they survive under conditions where they can't bring a lot of food with them, but they need to somehow climb the mountain, right? So, making these universal statements, I guess this is really what I want to caution against in this context, making universal statements against a particular food, which is a traditional food. Like if you're making universal statements against food that is, industrialized, processed, like you said about sugar sweetened beverages and so on, fine, great. But making broad categorical statements about foods which are traditional foods in many parts of the world, completely unwarranted. And probably, in his case, probably, like, I don't know if he knows he's lying or he's just forgetting his own data, but there's certainly evidence to disprove that hypothesis that there's no role for dairy fat
products because they get to then sell the high fat food separately.
I'm laughing a little bit because you said ice cream, and there was a study that was published, must have been 3 or 4 months ago. You probably saw this, that showed.
I don't know when this was recorded, but the study that I'm talking about is 2018. We'll take a look at that just now.
Ice cream consumption was associated with less, I'm not sure of what the outcome was. It was either a cardiometabolic outcome or mortality.
Right.
And a lot of people posted that to say, see,
Right.
how can epidemiology be trusted if it's coming up with results like
It's
this?
absolutely true. It's absolutely true that epidemiology can't be trusted, regardless of what result it comes up over ice cream, right? Nutritional epidemiology in specific, because the effect sizes we're looking at are just so tiny, they're irrelevant.
We did. I think that had some of our data in it. The one that just came out, it was I think a meta-analysis, but we did see this. And first of all, the amount still were. It wasn't daily consumption of ice cream. It was low, and probably just due to chance, the amounts consumed probably wouldn't have much effect. And I think if somebody likes ice cream, have it once a week or something, enjoy it, but not every day.
All right, let's take a look at this paper. So that same thing again. Let's look for ice cream. And I think we're going to start from the bottom. Okay, so this table is interesting. Hazard ratios, again, of cardiovascular disease risk according to intake of various dairy food in participants from those same cohorts with various exposure timing protocols, okay? So the interesting thing, let's compare again with yogurt. Yogurt, basically no effect, okay? 0.98 to 1.08, depending on which model they're using. I won't get into the problems with modeling here because these are all models that were being shown. But just look at the effect sizes for the ice cream. Much bigger, like in terms of an order of magnitude. If this is a 4%, or this is a 2% decrease, so you compare 2% with 18%, this is 900%. Ice cream is, you can, the statement I'm about to make is in accordance with this table that we're looking at. Ice cream consumption reduces the rate of cardiovascular disease 900% more than the consumption of yogurt. Yeah, that you could draw that from this particular data set. That's relative risk, right? That's why the numbers sound so silly, and they are. We shouldn't use those numbers. This one even more. So hazard ratios of cardiovascular disease risk according to intake of various dairy foods and foods from both NHS and so the same cohorts. This is specifically for diabetics, right? So they're using insulin or they're using probably glucophage, metformin in this period, right? If you are diabetic and you eat ice cream, I mean, now we're getting to statistical significance. Like 0.67, that's below the 0.75 threshold that we would like to see to indicate that perhaps something is causal. Now, all of these numbers, 0.67, it's in all of the models, that's interesting. Now, maybe you want to design a randomized controlled trial where one group of diabetics is giving ice cream every day and one group isn't, right? Maybe. Based on this, it would certainly be better than yogurt, which tends to be slightly worse for diabetics. Again, big hazard ratios. What's this now? Hazard ratio of cardiovascular disease risk according to intake of various dairy foods and participants from both images. Self-reported HbA1c levels. Okay. Again, this is similar because I guess if they're looking at their HbA1c, then probably they're in the diabetic or pre-diabetic. They're worried about that. And again, we find ice cream, the effect size is pretty huge. Yogurt, in this one, the effect size was also positive in this case. But again, the ice cream effect size was much bigger. Yeah, I think that proves the point. Let's go back. There's other tables in here that are definitely worth checking out, but let's go back here.
Growing up in Wisconsin, I did think we did have it every day.
There could be some benefits from the calcium, perhaps.
That maybe.
It's not the calcium, right? So listen, I hate to speculate because again, this is epidemiological data. It's just barely worth exploring further, just barely. But if it is worth exploring further, it's the opposite of what he's saying. It's the saturated fat is actually having a protective benefit, which is outweighing the excess carbohydrate, sugar consumption, et cetera, which might also explain the study that was done in the Indian Railways, which found that ghee was better than plant oils, even when the ghee was being consumed to excess. So even when the ghee was in the context of excess calories and excess carbohydrates, the population that was consuming the ghee did better. So that's not true, not the only possible explanation, but one possible explanation is that dairy, which is very high in saturated fat, is protective against these various diseases. And therefore, maybe certain populations at high risk should be prioritizing dairy fat. That's a hypothesis that needs to be explored, but it's a hypothesis that is consistent with the evidence, as opposed to whatever hypothesis these guys are advancing. I mean, the hypothesis they're advancing is that dairy fat is unhealthy. And I don't see anything, including the ice cream data that I just pointed to, which again, Dr. Willett was a professor. He was someone who graded that PhD dissertation back in 2018.
Yeah, I'm just trying to convince myself ice cream's healthy.
Yeah, but I would also want to look back to the climate part of it too, that and this Eat Lancet Commission that I co-chaired.
Wow, the Eat Lancet Commission, that is really, really bad. So let's see what he says.
Chaired a few years ago, we did look at how can we feed the world population a diet that's both healthy and sustainable. And for dairy, we said there is flexibility. There maybe a range of 0. You don't need to have dairy. You can get your nutrients from other sources, or it could be up to 2 servings a day, just strictly for individual health. But if we actually looked at, but dairy has a big greenhouse gas emission footprint, both because.
So the problem with that greenhouse gas emission, so from my understanding, just very briefly, I've written about this in other places, and maybe I'll link to some of my blog posts below. But listen, in my understanding, dairy cows have to be fed a majority like on grass and hay, basically grass and dry grass. And there's a small percentage of grains and sort of what they are is sort of industrial farming waste products, like say cotton seeds and so on, that can be fed to dairy cows to supplement their diet. The main diet has to be grass and so on. Now, when you have ruminants who have evolved with the grass, living on the grass, that is actually a way of sequestering carbon. And unfortunately, we don't have good measurements of this because a lot of it is not easy to understand. But just looking prima facie and looking at some of the work that Alan Savory and others have done, you can see that where you have a well-managed ruminant herd, the grasslands come back and you have desertification coming on, you have carbon sequestration coming on, especially at a deep level because those roots are super deep. So most of the data that he's citing or that he was using to base his research on doesn't consider the fact that the grasslands can be a massive carbon sink. Yeah,
because you have to feed the animal quite a bit of feed. In this country, 95% of the dairy is grain-fed dairy.
When he says 95% of the dairy is grain-fed, I suppose he's technically correct. But within that, like most of what you feed a grain-fed cow a dairy cow especially, is grass. Yeah, there is some, like I say, some what are basically industrial waste products, but for most cows at most times of the year, they're eating mostly grass or hay, right? And you can, if the interesting, there's a YouTube page, I want to say it's Iowa Dairy Farmer, or he's on Instagram too. He goes into this in a lot of detail, and you can see what he's feeding his cows and so on. He is not grass fed or anything like that. He's an industrial, dairy producer. And he talks about some of the problems with that as well, but it's certainly not the kind of picture that you would get from listening to people like Walter Willett.
And there's weak conversion of food to human edible food, but also a lot of greenhouse gas emissions from ruminants in general, methane production. And if everybody...
So that's nonsense. So when you're talking about methane production, you're forgetting that methane is part of a cycle, and that, the methane gets released by cow burps. That is true, but it also goes back in the soil. And this is when I did the research on this many years ago, ruminants have been on this planet for a lot longer than humans have, and in greater numbers, and during an ice age. Like, there was no climate change during that time. So this is so stupid, because they forget that all life lives in this kind of a carbon cycle, kind of a space, right? And yes, they emit carbon, like we also emit carbon. And by the way, if the cows didn't eat the grass, if it's cut, if it's not cut, the grass is going to die and release the same carbon. If it's cut, these grasses need to be cut from the top so that they grow down below. Though that cut grass is going to release the same amount of carbon anyway. So there's a lot of problems with the logic here.
We consumed 2 servings of dairy a day. We couldn't stay within greenhouse gas limits, even if we totally eliminated fossil fuel consumption. So from both a sustainability perspective and a health perspective, about 1 serving a day.
There's another thing, if you're talking about fossil fuel production or fossil fuel consumption, which is that where's the fertilizer going to come from? At the moment, fertilizer is either animal manure, mostly cow manure, and chicken manure too, or it's being derived from fossil fuels. So what are we going to grow? How are we going to deal with the soil crisis if we don't tend to our soil with manure, cow manure, et cetera, et cetera? So if he's saying we need to get rid of the cows, by implication, he's saying we need to increase the production of fossil fuels so that we can actually have a layer of soil. Otherwise, everyone's going to starve. There's not going to be any soil. At the moment, if you don't have topsoil that is derived from fossil fuels, or you don't have topsoil that is derived from manure, we got no topsoil. We're going to starve, right?
Seems like a good target number. And if somebody really wants to get calcium from a white liquid, some of the plant milk products are good alternatives.
Wow. Dangerous stuff, man. It's dangerous stuff to be saying that a plant milk that has only been consumed for, 40, 50 years at the levels that we have. Yes, someone will say, yes, soy milk has a history in China, which it does, but it was always consumed in very small amounts and as an additive, right? Or as an ingredient, and served along with meat products, mostly pork in the Chinese society. So you're saying that a very new food is safer than a very old food? Very reckless statement.
I think are good products like soy milk actually gives you some healthy fats, and it seems to be maybe some benefits from the phytoestrogens.
Can someone be just as healthy if they decide?
Just to those phytoestrogens, you can tell from the name, like, they are messing up with the metabolic balance. They're messing up with the sex hormones in our body. And if you think that that's healthy, the burden of proof is really on you. Like, you need to do pretty detailed, pretty long-term randomized controlled trials to prove that it might be healthy for some people at some time. Otherwise, the default expectation is that it's healthy for no person at no time. Maybe in very, very small amounts, it may be limitedly, it may not have a very big effect. That's another hypothesis, right? But these things should be seen with caution, simply because they are so new in the human food supply. And a lot of them, you look at the ingredients, they have crap in them. They have canola oil, expeller pressed canola oil, sunflower oil. So yeah, we would advise to stay the hell away from industrial, highly processed, ultra processed foods, as they say. That's another story. I'll have to make another video on ultra processed foods at another time, but those specific ultra processed foods, stay away from those ones.
Can someone be just as healthy if they decide not to consume any dairy at all and consume the right?
So this is a very weird question, man. Why are you framing the question like that? So, like, it's really this boils down to the burden of proof thing. If someone has a dairy allergy, for example, and I work with lots of people who have dairy allergies, yeah, you eliminate the dairy, you can find lots of replacements, no issues. But the question is, if someone doesn't have a dairy allergy, is there any reason to have less dairy than they want to? And the answer that I'm coming up with, based on all the understanding that I have, all the science that we can point to at the current moment, is no. There's no reason to limit dairy for any particular reason. And in fact, there are people, my friend Shashi Iyengar is one, you can see his interviews on this channel, who is a dairy-based, high protein, high fat, low carb person, and was able to reverse all of his problems. And he has, I don't know how many, I want to say at least 100 grams of paneer a day, so 100 grams of cheese a day, plus ghee, plus butter, et cetera, et cetera. So there are individual cases of people who have been able to reverse all their health problems on a high fat, dairy-based diet.
Foods in place of that.
I'm quite sure of that, yes. That interestingly, high dairy consumption is sort of an evolutionary aberration that's relatively recent and only in parts of the world. This doesn't prove anything, but it was interesting. Took a little survey at one of our department meetings in nutrition, and asked how much dairy people consumed after they.
So when you ask people at the T-Chan, Harvard's School of Public Health, which has been putting out sort of pro-vegan propaganda for 40, 50 years, you ask them how much dairy they consume, and surprise, the answer comes back.
We're very young children, and more than half said zero.
There you go. Like, surprise, surprise. Like, if you were a nutritionist who believed in consuming a lot of dairy, would you go and work for Harvard, for the T-Chan Nutrition School or whatever it's called? No, you wouldn't. You may even apply there, but you wouldn't be accepted, right? So this is one of those cases where institutions have their bias, they have their filters, and then that's just who came in the door, right? And then you survey the people who came in the door and you say that tells you something. It doesn't tell you anything, man.
And they were mostly people from Asia who just don't.
It is true that there's many cultures where dairy is not part of the culture, right? And China, traditional Chinese diets is one such place. But Asia also includes India, includes my part of the world, where probably my ancestors were eating dairy hundreds, thousands of years, long time, right? And doing fine. Specifically dairy fat in my case, because I come from sort of non-vegetarian people. Cheese and paneer, not really part of our diet. Milk, 100%, given to kids and adults as a health food. Yogurt, 100%, and mostly ghee.
Dairy is not part of the eating culture, and that's a big chunk of the world, and also many parts of Africa and Latin America. And these people are all college professors and doing pretty well at Harvard. So,
wow. So the fact that they're college professors in the T-Chan Nutrition School, which is a pro-vegan school, that's somehow supposed to indicate something? Like, come on, man.
They may end up a little bit shorter. Now, whether that's because dairy does accelerate height when consumed during childhood, and whether that's good or bad. Actually, I started looking at that because height is a risk factor for many cancers, and dairy is the one food that does drive height.
That's interesting. So height's
you know what else is a risk factor for many cancers? Obesity, right? And the relations with height, I've looked into it. It's not a super huge effect size. Yeah, it's there. But it doesn't, might just be random, what you see in those numbers.
Risk factor for many cancers, presumably because of just having more growth factors around?
I think probably so. That milk definitely has, milk consumption does increase insulin-like growth factor in our blood. There have been randomized studies that show that. And I think that's probably...
So I just want to draw your attention to the number of logical leaps he's making. Tall people get more cancer. That is true. Tall people may have consumed more dairy. That he doesn't know for sure. He hasn't done the research to back that up. Therefore, the nutrient in dairy is what's causing the cancer. Like, that doesn't make any sense at all. So many logical leaps here.
That acceleration of cell multiplication during childhood, which we know is a critical time, is probably the reason why milk consumption is related to more cancer. That's hypothesis, but we do see the dots there that are not too hard to connect. Also, interestingly, when we looked at adolescent milk consumption and rate of fractures later in life, there was absolutely no benefit with high dairy consumption. There was only increased fractures later in life among boys. And I think that's due to the growth acceleration, and it creates long bones that are easier to break than short bones.
When it comes to gut health.
Okay, what to say about this video? I think the main thing is that whatever conclusions these guys are drawing are based on very weak associations. You can tell with the way he talked about yogurt as a health food and ice cream is not, when in fact in the raw data that I showed, or the models that I showed that were by his own department, he found the ice cream effect size much bigger, in one case 900% bigger than the yogurt effect size, right? And the yogurt effect size was so small it could have just been random, right? So what to take away from this? I'm not sure what to take away. Again, as I said in the last video, I'm not someone who advocates dairy necessarily as healthy. It entered the diet only a few thousand years ago, and as he said, only in some places. And for some people, it doesn't appear to be healthy. Like, for some people, they seem to have a reaction. But in my experience, for most people, I would say almost all people, once we heal the gut, we can use dairy foods if you like them, if you want to include them as part of an animal-based diet or whatever you want to call it, a low carb, high fat, high in meat diet that can be used to reverse all kinds of diseases, including gut autoimmune issues. So that's some food for thought. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next one.